The first stage of their suffering often began immediately after capture. Queens were usually seized during the collapse of their cities, dragged from palaces or camps in front of their own people. Roman soldiers were encouraged to strip enemies of all visible symbols of power. Royal clothing was torn away, jewelry ripped from their bodies, crowns crushed under boots. This was not random cruelty. It was ritual humiliation. The goal was to show everyone watching that the gods of Rome had conquered the gods of the defeated land. Ancient sources describe captured queens being bound with ropes or chains and forced to march behind Roman troops. This march was slow and deliberate. Soldiers jeered. Crowds were allowed to gather. The queen was displayed like a living trophy, a warning to any city that still thought of resisting. For women who had been treated as semi-divine figures, this public degradation was psychologically devastating. Then came imprisonment, if it can even be called that. Queens were not placed in comfortable cells. They were thrown into military holding areas, sometimes underground, sometimes in makeshift cages. They were guarded not for safety, but to ensure survival for later use. Roman commanders often wanted captured queens alive, not out of mercy, but because living captives had political value. One of the most terrifying aspects of their captivity was uncertainty. Roman soldiers used waiting as a weapon. Days or weeks could pass with no explanation of what would happen next. Food was given sparingly, sleep was interrupted, guards mocked them, reminding them that their people were now enslaved, their cities burned, their children taken. This psychological torment was intentional. Breaking the mind was as important as breaking the body. When the time came for transport to Rome, the horror escalated. Queens were forced to travel long distances in chains, exposed to weather, sickness, and exhaustion. Along the way, Roman soldiers often paraded them through allied cities. Each stop reinforced the message, "This is what happens to those who defy Rome." Upon reaching Rome, the fate of a captured queen depended on political calculation. Some were destined for the ultimate humiliation, the Roman triumph. A triumph was Rome's greatest celebration of victory. Streets were decorated, crowds gathered, generals rode in chariots, and behind them, chained and defeated, walked the spoils of war. Among gold, weapons, and exotic animals, a queen was the most powerful symbol of all. Imagine being forced to walk through cheering crowds, chained, exhausted, and stripped of dignity, while strangers screamed insults and laughed. Roman citizens were encouraged to participate. This public shaming was meant to erase the queen's former identity and rewrite her story as a defeated enemy of Rome. Ancient writers tell us that some queens were dressed deliberately in mocking versions of their royal attire, exaggerated or torn, to make them look ridiculous rather than majestic. Others were barely clothed at all, exposed to the gaze of tens of thousands. For Rome, shame was a weapon sharper than any sword. After the triumph, the story often ended in death. Many captured queens were executed shortly after the celebration. Execution methods were chosen not for speed, but for symbolism. Some were strangled in prison, quietly and without witnesses, as if their lives were unworthy of ceremony. Others were executed publicly to satisfy the crowd's hunger for spectacle. But death was not always immediate. In some cases, Roman soldiers and officials used queens as bargaining tools. They were threatened with further humiliation or harm unless their people complied with Roman demands. Even in captivity, these women were forced to watch the destruction of their own nations. One of the most stomach-turning aspects recorded by ancient historians is the deliberate violation of royal status. Roman soldiers believed that conquering a queen meant conquering her land completely. This belief led to acts meant to symbolically destroy lineage and legacy. While ancient writers often used vague language, the implication is clear. Queens were subjected to treatment designed to strip them of honor and erase their bloodline's future. These acts were not about desire, they were about domination. It is important to understand that Roman soldiers were rarely punished for such behavior. In conquered territories, they acted with near total impunity. Commanders often looked the other way, as long as discipline in battle remained intact. For soldiers, captured queens were rewards, proof that they had helped crush a powerful enemy. Some queens chose another path. Faced with capture, humiliation, and torment, a few took their own lives before Roman soldiers could claim them. Ancient sources describe this not as cowardice, but as defiance. To Rome, this was infuriating. A dead queen could not be paraded, could not be humiliated, could not serve as a warning. That is why Roman soldiers often tried to capture queens alive at any cost. The story of Boudica of Britain, though she escaped capture, reveals how Roman soldiers treated royal women even before queens fell. Her daughters were abused, her authority mocked, her people enslaved. This was not an exception. It was a preview of what awaited any queen who lost. Cleopatra, one of the most famous queens in history, understood this reality better than anyone. After her defeat, she knew exactly what awaited her in Rome: chains, parades, mockery, execution. Her decision to die on her own terms was a direct rejection of the fate Roman soldiers had prepared for her. What makes these stories so disturbing is not just the cruelty, but how normalized it was. Roman writers recorded these events without outrage. For them, this was simply how power worked. Victory gave the right to do anything. The suffering of captured queens was a tool, not a tragedy. Even centuries later, Roman triumphs were celebrated in art and literature, while the voices of the defeated were erased. Statues showed generals standing tall. Reliefs showed chained captives. But the fear, pain, and humiliation of the queens behind those chains were never carved in stone. When modern audiences imagine Rome, they often think of law, roads, and civilization. But for those who stood against it, Rome was a machine that consumed identities. Captured queens were not just prisoners. They were lessons written in flesh and memory, meant to echo across generations. So the next time you see a painting of a Roman triumph, look closely at the figures in chains. Imagine the journey that led them there. Imagine the nights of fear, the days of humiliation, the